The world watched. Cameras rolled. Journalists whispered. The United Nations Global Security Summit in Geneva had just begun. As leaders filed into the massive conference hall, names appeared on gold nameplates, each carefully arranged. One, chair in particular marked for Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, sat beside a name even louder: Donald J. Trump. But then the room shifted. Trump stopped in his tracks. He glanced at Traoré's seat, shook his head, then whispered to his aide. Moments later, an assistant rushed forward, removed Trump's nameplate, and placed it on a chair, across the room far away. Gasps filled the hall. Everyone noticed. Cameras zoomed in. A deep, uncomfortable silence hovered. But Captain Traoré didn't flinch. He stood calm, strong, still. What was happening? Why was Trump avoiding him? A journalist tweeted, "Trump just refused to sit beside Captain Traoré. Live humiliation or something deeper?" And then Traoré slowly walked to his seat alone and sat down, his eyes fixed on Trump across the room. The tension could be sliced with a knife. No one said a word. But what Traoré did next, no one expected. Traoré leaned forward, adjusted his microphone, and softly cleared his throat. The hall fell dead silent. The moderator hadn't even begun the summit yet, but something about Traoré's composure made the room wait. "I am here," he said slowly, not to make enemies but to tell the truth. Reporters leaned in. Every major outlet, CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, went live. He continued, "If a man refuses to sit near you, ask yourself, what truth does he fear?" The room froze. Trump didn't speak. His face tightened. The camera briefly showed him whispering to an aide again, but Traoré didn't look away. He paused, then calmly added, "I came here because my people don't eat speeches. They eat rice. They drink clean water. They sleep in peace. I didn't come for politics. I came for life." Some in the room teared up. Delegates from Mali, Niger, and even parts of Europe subtly nodded. He hadn't raised his voice once, but the blow had landed harder than a thunderclap. That clip was reposted 37 million times in just 2 hours. What happened next wasn't on the program, but it changed the summit forever. Just as the moderator tried to regain control, something unusual happened. A woman, gay-haired, French-accented, dignified, stood up from the EU delegation. She didn't ask for the mic, she didn't wait for permission. Her voice trembled. "I've been in these rooms for 30 years, she said, and I have never seen someone speak like that without anger, without fear, and with so much truth." She pointed at Traoré. "You, Captain, you remind me of Patrice Lumumba, of Sankara. You speak for Africa, but somehow you're speaking for us all." The room was still. Captain Traoré didn't blink. He simply nodded in gratitude. Across the hall, Trump folded his arms tightly. The moderator, overwhelmed, cleared his throat. Let's begin with the first agenda." But it was too late. The summit was no longer about climate or oil or policy. It was now about presence, about dignity. And for the first time in decades, someone from a small nation had shifted the power in the room with just words. And yet this was only the beginning, because outside the building a protest was forming. The summit's glass walls couldn't hide what was happening outside. Hundreds had gathered, waving handmade signs. "Dignity for Africa, stand with Traoré, and even let truth speak." They weren't just Burkina Faso. There were students from France, doctors from Ghana, exiled journalists. Even a few retired U.S. veterans stood, holding peace signs. Inside, delegates' phones buzzed with updates. A live feed showed the crowd swelling. One woman held a photo of her son killed in a drone strike years ago. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "He only wanted a school, not a war." Meanwhile, Traoré sat still, eyes lowered for a moment. He had seen things no camera could catch. Children dying from bad water. Mothers feeding 3 kids with a single yam. Trump remained across the room, stone-faced, arms crossed as if the rising support outside meant nothing. But it meant everything because for the first time, the voice of a small, often ignored country had reached the gates of power. And inside the summit, pressure was building. Someone had to respond. And to everyone's surprise, the next person to speak wasn't a politician. It was a teenager. A trembling hand went up. The moderator looked confused. You're not on the list. But the young man stood anyway. Brown skin, nervous eyes, a UN Youth Observer badge around his neck. I don't need to be on a list, he said softly. I just need 5 seconds. The room hesitated. Cameras zoomed in. He turned to Traoré and spoke directly. My name is Kofi. I was born in a refugee camp in Niger. I watched my father die waiting for medicine that never came. But last year I heard about a young captain who took back the gold from the West and gave it to the people. Kofi paused, tears welling. You inspired me to study leadership. Today I skipped school just to see you speak. There wasn't a dry eye. Even diplomats who'd come to argue felt their throats tighten. Trey slowly stood and walked to the boy. He didn't say a word. He simply placed a hand on his shoulder and gave a small nod. That one gesture said more than any speech. And then, without warning, Trump pushed his mic forward. Everyone turned. Was he finally about to explain why he avoided Traoré? Trump tapped the mic once. His face looked stiff, calculated. But instead of speaking, he pushed his chair back and stood up. Everyone watched. He straightened his suit, glanced around, then walked out of the summit without saying a single word. Gasps filled the room. One delegate whispered, "He's walking away from the conversation." Others stared in disbelief. The cameras caught every step as Trump exited, ignoring reporters shouting his name. Traoré remained silent. His expression didn't change. He simply watched him leave, calm, still, dignified. And then Traoré leaned forward and said, "When silence becomes a tool of power, we must answer with truth, not rage." Thunderous applause erupted, but deep inside something was stirring in Traoré. He wasn't angry, but he was tired. Tired of being treated like a guest in rooms he had earned his way into. Tired of seeing African leaders mocked while their people suffered. Yet now the whole world was watching him, and he knew he had to say something next. Something the world would never forget. Something that would break people wide open. And he would wait for the perfect moment to do it. Captain Ibrahim Traoré sat silently as the cameras captured every breath, every blink. The world watched, but no one saw the heaviness he carried. The faces of his people etched in his mind. He remembered the dusty streets of Ouagadougou, the hungry children playing beside cracked wells and mothers who prayed for just one safe night. His hands clenched quietly. Years of fighting colonial legacies, standing against powerful nations who thought his country small, insignificant. Tonight it wasn't just a summit. It was a test. Could he show the world the strength of Burkina Faso without breaking? Could he speak for those silenced by poverty and war? His heart ached for the farmer who lost his land to greed, the student who dropped out to feed her family, and the elderly man who watched his grandchildren leave with no hope of return. All eyes were on him now, waiting. Trey's lips moved in a silent promise to never forget, to never bow, and to always fight, because this was bigger than politics. It was about dignity. And in the quiet, he found a deep resolve. Suddenly, the room shifted again. From the far corner, a young delegate from Canada, barely 28, stood up. She wasn't on the agenda. "I must speak," she said firmly, her voice trembling with emotion. "I come from a land of privilege, but my heart aches for those left behind, like the people Captain Traoré represents." She looked directly at Traoré. "You remind us all that leadership isn't about power, but about sacrifice." The room hushed. She spoke of her grandmother, a survivor of war who taught her that courage is louder than guns. "I believe in your vision, Captain," she said, tears shining, "and I stand with you." Traoré's eyes softened. He nodded gratefully. For a moment, the divide seemed smaller. Politics and prejudice faded beneath a shared humanity. Even Trump, watching from the sidelines, seemed unsettled. The summit wasn't what anyone expected. And outside, the crowd's chant grew louder. Justice, justice, justice. The summit was about to end. Traoré was called to speak, last. He rose slowly, steadying himself under the bright lights. The room fell silent. He looked around at every face, every camera, every listener around the world. Then, with a voice both soft and commanding, he said, "My people taught me this. Dignity is not given, it is earned. And when those who hold power refuse to sit beside us, it is not because of fear, but because they refuse to see us as equals." He paused, tears welling in many eyes. "But I do not come to ask for their approval. I come to demand justice not just for Burkina Faso, but for every nation whose voice is silenced." The crowd was frozen, and in that moment, the impossible happened. A woman in the front row stood and started to clap, then another. Soon the whole room erupted into a standing ovation. Traoré's calm words had broken the ice, but the world still waited for what would come next. As the applause died down, the tension returned like a cold wave. Traoré's calm gaze swept across the room. Diplomats, journalists, even those watching from distant homes, all waiting for more. He adjusted his jacket, the weight of history pressing on his shoulders. Then he began, "When a leader refuses to sit beside you, it is more than a refusal of space. It is a refusal of respect. But I do not seek respect from those who have never respected my people." His voice was steady, but every word carried the stories of millions who had suffered in silence. In Burkina Faso, children walk miles for clean water. Mothers bury their dreams with their children. We live the consequences of neglect, of greed. The room grew quieter, many eyes glistening. I am not angry. I am hopeful. Because even in this silence, I see the strength of my people, the power of truth. He paused, then softly said, "We will not be ignored any longer." A single tear escaped his eye. And somewhere deep in the room, a camera caught it. After Traoré's words, an unexpected wave began. Delegates whispered among themselves. Some pulled out their phones, sharing live clips. Social media exploded. Hashtags like Stand with Traoré and Dignity for Africa began trending worldwide. Backstage reporters scrambled for interviews. Meanwhile, Traoré quietly sat down, hands folded, eyes steady, but heart pounding. He had spoken not just for Burkina Faso, but for millions whose voices were drowned out across the room. Trump's face showed a flicker. Was it regret or disbelief? No one knew, but Traoré's calm had created a silent rebellion. One not fought with weapons, but with courage and truth. Outside, the protests grew louder. Inside, hearts were changing. And for the first time, the summit wasn't just about politics. It was about justice. Just when it seemed the moment couldn't get any more intense, an announcement was made. A surprise press conference right after the summit. Everyone's curiosity spiked. Traoré stood, the weight of the world on his shoulders. But instead of anger or defiance, there was something else. A gentle, humble smile. The room buzzed with anticipation. He addressed the crowd outside, live cameras rolling. "I do not stand here to divide," he said softly, "but to unite, to remind us all that true leadership is service to every child who deserves a future." The world held its breath, and as he spoke, even those who doubted began to feel something deep and undeniable. Hope, because sometimes the most powerful revolution is not with fists but with words, and Traoré's words were about to echo far beyond that room. News of the summit moment spread like wildfire. Videos of Trump refusing to sit beside Traoré flooded social media. But it was Traoré's calm response that truly captured hearts. From the dusty streets of Ouagadougou to the skyscrapers of New York, millions watched in disbelief and awe. People shared stories of their own struggles, of being ignored, pushed aside, and yet finding strength in silence. The world began to see Traoré not just as a leader, but as a symbol of hope. He wasn't perfect. He was real. His humility and quiet strength made people believe in the impossible. Every retweet, every share added fuel to a fire that was spreading, beyond politics, into the souls of those who dared to dream of justice. Even those far from Burkina Faso felt a connection. And the summit's tension was no longer about geography or power, but about a universal fight for dignity. Behind closed doors, away from cameras, Traoré found a quiet corner. A young aide approached, nervously. "Captain," she said softly, "the world is watching. They're inspired. But there are those who want to silence this moment." Traoré looked out a window, eyes distant but clear. "This is only the beginning," he said quietly. "Truth has a way of breaking walls. But the path is never easy." He thought of the sacrifices of friends lost, nights spent wondering if the fight was worth it. But then he remembered the faces of children in his country, their hopeful eyes shining bright. He clenched his fist. "For them, I will keep speaking." That night, in the stillness, a leader renewed his promise not to bow, not to break, but to keep standing. The next day, headlines blazed across the globe. Traoré's triumph, when silence spoke louder than words. Commentators debated, some mocked, some praised, but the majority felt something rare, a stirring in their hearts. In schools, teachers showed the video to children, teaching lessons about courage and dignity. In cafes, strangers discussed the power of respect, and across continents, protests and rallies emerged, not against Traoré but for the dignity he represented. This was no longer just a story about two men. It was a story about all of us. A story about standing tall when the world tries to push you down. And the question on everyone's lips was no longer what did Traoré say, but what will we say when it's our turn? News of the summit moment spread like wildfire. Videos of Trump refusing to sit beside Traoré flooded social media. But it was Traoré's calm response that truly captured hearts. From the dusty streets of Ouagadougou to the skyscrapers of New York, millions watched in disbelief and awe. People shared stories of their own struggles, of being ignored, pushed aside, and yet finding strength in silence. The world began to see Traoré not just as a leader but as a symbol of hope. He wasn't perfect. He was real. His humility and quiet strength made people believe in the impossible. Every retweet, every share added fuel to a fire that was spreading beyond politics, into the souls of those who dared to dream of justice. Even those far from Burkina Faso felt a connection, and the summit's tension was no longer about geography or power, but about a universal fight for dignity. Behind closed doors, away from cameras, Traoré found a quiet corner. A young aide approached nervously. "Captain," she said softly, "the world is watching. They're inspired, but there are those who want to silence this moment." Traoré looked out a window, eyes distant but clear. "This is only the beginning," he said quietly. "Truth has a way of breaking walls, but the path is never easy." He thought of the sacrifices of friends lost, nights spent wondering if the fight was worth it. But then he remembered the faces of children in his country, their hopeful eyes shining bright. He clenched his fist. "For them, I will keep speaking." That night, in the stillness, a leader renewed his promise not to bow, not to break, but to keep standing. The next day, headlines blazed across the globe. Traoré's triumph when silence spoke louder than words. Commentators debated, some mocked, some praised, but the majority felt something rare, a stirring in their hearts. In schools, teachers showed the video to children, teaching lessons about courage and dignity. In cafes, strangers discussed the power of respect. And across continents, protests and rallies emerged, not against Traoré, but for the dignity he represented. This was no longer just a story about two men. It was a story about all of us. A story about standing tall when the world tries to push you down. And the question on everyone's lips was no longer what did Traoré say, but what will we say when it's our